I have the honor of calling upon Mr. Burzin Dubash, Executive Director and Partner, Access Risk Consulting. Sir is responsible for India practice and is also spearheading Access foray into China and Middle East markets. He has extensive experience in corporate governance advisory, internal audits, operational process improvement, enterprise risk management, amongst others. Sir has worked on several global engagements across North America, Western Europe, and Asia. Prior to joining Access, Mr. Dubash spent 12 years with Arthur Andersen and Ernst & Young as part of their assurance and business advisory practice, where he worked on financial audits, US GAAP reviews, and mergers and acquisition transaction support projects for clients covering a wide range of industries. Sir is a chartered accountant and a certified fraud examiner. He is also a Fulbright Fellow, having completed the Fulbright Nehru CII Fellowship Program at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business. We welcome you, sir, to SITM. Mr. Dubash will address the congregation today on the topic, Risk Management in Telecom. I request sir to kindly preside over the session.
Good afternoon, everybody, thank you for the introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be amongst all of you this afternoon. So, I think picking up on the topic that I thought I was most qualified to talk about, I am going to limit my session today to essentially, bringing in a business angle to telecom and help you understand what I'm seeing today in working with several companies in helping them to manage their risk. At the outset, let me confess, I am not a telecom techie. I've got into this field only for the past 4-5 years, and my perspective of looking at telecom is more from a business perspective, is more from a risk perspective, and is actually been derived from the fact that I worked with a few telecom companies and I worked with other industries as well in helping companies to achieve their business objectives at the end of the day. Can we start the... So I think this is a quote which, when it got made, was not very noteworthy, but actually became so after the occurrence of an event. And that quote was actually made by the captain of the Titanic, which I guess needs no introduction. But picking up from this one event, I think there are many lessons that one draws, which I'm trying to sort of draw a parallel into how corporates should learn from this tragedy, and then I'm going to relate that to how do you extend that to telecom companies. So if you learn the lessons from the Titanic, I think they're very sort of typical management lessons that you would learn about. In terms of having sort of clear ownership of roles and responsibilities, of making sure that the lines of communication are open and adequate and timely, of making sure that the right information is being fed to the right decision makers, and that those decision makers indeed take that information seriously and act upon it. And therefore, what you have on the screen here are essentially lessons that one sort of learned from this entire sort of Titanic episode. So as the sort of challenges and opportunities facing telecom operators around the world continue to evolve. The risk universe in this sector is particularly changing, and is changing very rapidly. And as companies continue to formulate and execute their strategies, and they think about sort of growing and sustaining value creation, they have to ensure that their understanding and management of risk in what they are doing also keeps pace with the pace of growth that they are aspiring to achieve. At the end of the day, any business is all about achieving your objectives. Any new product launch, any new technology launched, at the end of the day, has an objective to be met, which can be expressed in many different facets. One of them, of course, is a commercial objective that you are seeking to achieve. And in today's environment, where the external conditions are so tough, and they are so ever-changing, and they are so unstable, I think, especially for an entity who is today in the telecom space, understanding what are the risks that they are faced with, and then coming up with a strategy that tries to address that is extremely critical. Despite, or in some cases because of, the continuing uncertainty in the telecom space, there are several opportunities that arise for telecom companies. And the ability of a company to identify and act upon these trends at the end of the day is what's going to differentiate the good companies from the not so good companies. And unless this growth strategy has a very strong underpinning of risk management, it's not going to be sustainable. And I think that's what we are learning over the past few years of actually seeing even the Indian telecom industry evolve, is that there have been many players who did well in spurts. But the ones who are sustaining themselves and continue to do well obviously have a very deep understanding of what they're good at, what they're not so good at, and they continue to evolve that as they go along. So the telecom sector's profile is continuously evolving. I'm not here to talk to you about each of these specific risks, but I think they're all pretty self-evident. And the reason why I want to put up this slide is I want to give you a perspective that the gamut of risks that a telecom company faces is pretty wide. You obviously have all the regulatory sort of risk, and I think that there's enough been said and written in the newspapers and television for me to elaborate upon that. But there is stuff around talent availability. I mean, telecom industry at the end of the day is a 10, 12-year-old industry. There aren't too many sort of people who are available who understand and can meet that need, and therefore there's a constant war for talent that's happening. You have companies who need to change their asset strategies. I mean, we've all spoken about cloud computing. We've spoken about how companies are now outsourcing their passive infrastructure management. We've all heard about Bharti's sort of story of outsourcing IT management, network management, and many companies are now sort of catching up, but you can clearly see the impact of that time lag between the time that Bharti Airtel decided to undertake that strategy and what the others are now doing to catch up to it. And that is a consequence of risk management, because they essentially identified what their risks were and which risks did they think they were most equipped to handle, and they chose to focus on that, and they chose to outsource other risks to other experts and actually sort of get the leverage of 1 + 1 = 3. You also have distribution channels which are changing. Rural markets are getting more and more attractive, and therefore the distribution channels that worked in the urban metros and the ABC class of towns do not work in the D category towns and the rural markets. And therefore, companies are being forced to relook at how do they distribute their products. And at the end of the day, customer expectations are rising. I'm sure all of us want everything free of cost. And the moment that any one of us actually goes out of India and we pick up a local SIM card in those countries, it's then that you really realize how good we have it here. And the whole customer expectation around what they want for the price that we are paying is also a issue that most telecom companies really need to deal with. But all of these are external facing. And these are the ones that hit you in your face when you open the newspapers every day. Most organizations are also faced with a myriad of internal risks. These are risks that revolve around how are they structured? Are they centralized? Are they decentralized? How is decision-making devolved? What is the flexibility within which the organization can make decisions? How do you deal with complex accounting for subscriber acquisition costs, for financial instruments, for swap arrangements? How do you deal with talent retention? The acquisition was one part. There's even the retention part once you've gotten them through the door. Everybody's young, everybody has great aspirations, and therefore the need to continuously engage with them and ensure that they stick around, and the whole cost-benefit equation is one that works for both parties, is something which most telecom companies are grappling with on an everyday basis. And in trying to understand and react to each of these aspects that I've just sort of brought about, there is the overwhelming expectation that at the end of it all, there is a stakeholder who has his own aspirations. In the case of telecom, there are broadly two stakeholders. One is the government, who is essentially wanting to ensure that cheap, affordable telecom services are available to a vast majority of its population. And at the other end are all the parties who have obviously invested into all these companies and are therefore interested in getting a reasonable return on their investment. And therefore, if you picture yourself to be the top management of any telecom company, and you go deal with all these aspects on a day-on-day basis, and you can very well imagine that these items are not static and they are particularly volatile, you can just imagine what that does to the quality of the decision-making that they are forced to take on a day-to-day basis. As a result, the investor's view of the telecom industry remains fundamentally ambivalent, resulting in the difficulty of reconciling the structural weaknesses that are there today, essentially around the heavy regulation that's there, and the specific opportunities for growth that you see, because everybody is still growing top lines, everybody is still adding subscribers, and you sort of keep seeing headlines in the press every now and then of the growth that's happened in terms of the whole subscriber numbers. But is that translating into profitable growth in one which the stakeholder or one of those two stakeholders is actually interested in achieving? And therefore, there's always a concern over the trade-off that happens between the cost of growth and the absolute growth itself. And you add to that the need to invest into capex for you to realize that growth, and you can well imagine the dichotomy that I'm talking about of what managements are having to go through. Against this backdrop, I think managements of telecom companies have to focus on a model that actually creates a more longer-term value as opposed to a short-term dividend. And the only way they can do that is if they can constantly focus on the risks that might derail the company's objectives of these achievements, and therefore enter enterprise risk management. This is not a new concept. It's been there for the last 15 years in its current avatar. It existed in different avatars before that. But the recent avatar, as it exists for enterprise risk management, and for which there is a framework that was developed maybe about 15, 20 years ago by the organization known as COSO, essentially defines enterprise risk management. And it has got several elements to it which I thought are key, and which is what I have underlined in red on the screen. It's done at the very top The board of directors are involved in that. It is applied in strategies, setting across the organization, and it's not limited to only pieces of it. It attempts to identify potential events that may affect that entity and bring those down to an acceptable level in line with what is the risk appetite of that organization, and essentially which results in reasonable assurance towards achievement of the entity's objectives. It's a very complex sort of statement, and each sort of sequence of words there are pretty important to understand what is it that enterprise-wide risk management is attempting to achieve. So let's get into a little bit of detail to try and demystify some of what is written on the screen. Why is ERM important? At the end of the day, value for any organization gets created by the decisions that management makes in its day-to-day activities. And the more informed and inspired those decisions are, the better is the quality of the outcome. And entities that fail to recognize the risk they face from either external or internal sources, and who fail to manage them, can effectively destroy shareholder value in absolute and relative terms for shareholders, stakeholders, including the community and the society at large. So enterprise risk management essentially facilitates management's ability to deal with the potential future events that cause uncertainty. It provides management with a mechanism in which you can identify, prioritize, and then learn to deal with them. And I'll talk a little bit later on how do you deal with the risks that emanate out of this whole exercise. It also permits management a framework within which it is able to effectively communicate all of this to its stakeholders, both internal as well as external, because being able to communicate effectively what are the risks as you foresee them and what is your response to that is a very important aspect of corporate communications that happen on a day-to-day basis. If any one of you all would have read annual reports, especially the reports which are required by the SEC under US GAAP, you'll see there's a huge section there that talks about risks that the management perceives and what their response to each of these risks are. And that, in fact, is one of the first few sections in the entire reporting that happens, and the financial statements and everything else actually comes much, much later. And therefore, that is the importance of being able to communicate all these risks. The other important view that I want to leave with you all is that you cannot look at risk in isolation. Risk has to be viewed at a portfolio level. And therefore, you will have several moving parts in any organization, more so in the case of telecom, which unfortunately also has the element of uncertainty in the regulatory framework within which it is meant to operate within. And therefore, if you add to all of it, there you have to take a portfolio view of risks and not look at risks individually, because then you will not be able to get the right impact of what you're trying to do. So, assuming that business goes on, and I'm not going to now focus on the regulatory risks that essentially sort of question the viability of certain companies as we speak today, but let's just now sort of get down to operating companies who are operating in this country legally for the past several years, and see how does this framework impact them. So every entity's objectives can be viewed in 4 categories. There's strategic, there's operational, there's a reporting element, and there's a compliance element. And you view all of this in the context of the entity, of the subsidiary, of the business unit, and therefore you splice it up. And you are looking at all the various components that sort of make up this whole COSO framework, which starts at the top of understanding what your internal environment is, of understanding what is the risk appetite that that company is acceptable to them. And then everything else flows from that understanding. Therefore, you start the internal environment, you set your objectives, you do a event identification exercise, so then you try and assess what are the risks that might emanate from that event. You then come to a risk response. You identify what are the control activities that you will put in place to mitigate those risks. You will then sort of communicate that to everybody within the organization such that everybody is then pulling their weight in the same direction. And then finally, you will continuously monitor the fact that there aren't any new risks which are coming up, and that the existing risks that you've identified and the action plans that you have put in place to mitigate those risks are indeed operating as you intended them to. And therefore, this sort of framework continuously sort of circularizes itself in a sense that you keep doing these activities every now and then to ensure that you are up to speed as far as risk management is concerned. So how does ERM happen in practice? The start of the enterprise risk management process is one of identifying the risk and the processes. And that usually happens through extensive interviews with all the top management sort of team in the organization, a understanding of that company's financial information, a understanding of the industry environment in which the company operates within. You use that then to essentially develop a risk library, which you then prioritize basis a tolerance scale that you then co-develop with the company. That scale essentially is a two-dimensional scale, which talks about the impact of an event should that event occur, and it also attempts to estimate what might be the probability of occurrence of that actual event. And therefore, you essentially have either a 3x3, 4x4, 5x5, whatever scale that you work out. You essentially have a scale that measures impact on one axis and measures probability of occurrence on the other axis. And basis how you plot those events or the portfolio view of events, you are able to then get a relative prioritization of what are the key risks that are facing that company. This, unlike several models that might work in the banking financial services space, is not a quantitative model. It, of course, has some linkages back to numbers, etc., but there's a lot of judgment that actually goes into determination of this prioritization, and there is qualitative assessments that the managements are making in saying, in risk ranking, their top 10, 20, 30 odd risks. Having done that, you essentially would then develop mitigation plans. Some companies choose to focus on the top red zone. Some companies choose to focus on all of it. I mean, just to give you an example, at the end of this exercise, and we did one recently for a 2,000 crore company, we ended up with about 125 odd risks. Now, it's practically impossible to monitor 125 action items for the 125 risks. And therefore, you use this relative prioritization to end up sort of focusing on the top 20 and ensuring that those get reviewed on a quarterly basis. And on an annual basis, you then end up looking at the remaining 105 odd. So I think that's how it actually happens in practice. And that's the ongoing evaluation and in reporting piece. So I spoke about how can you react once you have identified a risk. And broadly, there are 4 sort of strategies that a company can deploy in dealing with these risks. The first one essentially talks about avoiding those risks. So let me give you an example. Some time back, there was an uproar in the Indian markets around the use of Chinese manufactured equipment in the telecom space. And given the cost efficiencies, many companies were using equipment which was manufactured in China to roll out their networks. And during that 3-6 month period, while there was uncertainty, they just stopped rolling out any more networks. So identified a risk. In this case, they weren't sure what is the view that the government will finally take on their capital investments, and therefore they chose to avoid that risk by simply stopping it. You, of course, can transfer that risk out as well. And everybody will think about insurance. Yes, that is one way of transferring a risk out, but outsourcing is also another way of transferring a risk out. And that's what many companies are doing today. They have already transferred out management of their networks to the experts. They have transferred out management of their IT, again to experts. They have outsourced their customer relationship management pieces around the whole voice piece of it. So companies are essentially using the ability to outsource in a bid to, well, yes, you will get cost efficiencies and all the rest, but you're also ensuring that the experts in that particular field are doing that activity, and thereby you are also minimizing the risk of you not doing that activity well. You obviously have the whole exploit piece, and a good example of that was Tata Teleservices, when they exploited that whole per second billing that they came up with. They found a new technology by which they could actually measure the pulse at a per second level as opposed to a per minute level, which was in vogue until then. And if you see the subscriber numbers and the revenue numbers in the first 2 months after Tata Indicom came out with their per second billing model, it zoomed. It just shot through the roof. But within 2 months' time, all the other telcos had caught up with that. Everybody came out with a per second billing plan, and that competitive advantage was essentially lost. So the risk here was around how your billing models are evolving, how the customer expectations are changing, and in this case, TTSL managed to ride on a IT innovation of being able to capture the pulse at a second level, and they use that to their competitive advantage in being the first mover to the market and actually grabbing that market share in the months that they did. So here's an example how you have taken a risk and you have essentially exploited your strategy that you put in place to deal with that risk around pricing and customer expectation. The last one essentially is reduce, where essentially there's a host of risks that you are taking on yourself. And essentially, you are putting in place controls to make sure that the impact of those risks are minimized. I mean, take, for example, the classic case that in the case of telecom, which is again very unique, the government seems to have divested the ownership of subscriber verification actually on the telecom companies. And they refuse to accept even government-issued identification as the only means for them to do that, and they're asking telecom companies to go and have their own address verification for every subscriber that they have on their network. Ostensibly, it uses the whole security angle to it, but there is a government identification that is there through your passport, through your PAN card, through your ration card, through whatever the means, but you're still having the company to do that. That becomes an imperative absent which you can't do business. And therefore, all the other aspects of transfer, exploit, avoid, don't apply. And therefore, you're forced to retain this risk of you not doing that. And therefore, what you're doing is that you're putting in place some very tight controls to ensure that all your distributors and all your dealers are taking adequate steps to ensure that all documents are being collected. There's a process that attempts to verify that. There are specialist document management companies that scan them and keep them ready for verification. And therefore, you're going through a whole series of steps, and you're putting in place some very expensive controls to essentially mitigate that risk of that regulation which requires a telecom company to verify every subscriber that it adds onto their network. So this is exactly the model that you are using once having identified what your risks are to take a decision on what do you want to do with it. And you essentially use this as a means to arrive at your action plans. And then, like I said, you've got to keep reviewing them at least for your top 10, 20 odd risks on a quarterly basis, and for the remainder of them on an annual basis at least. I think that's how the whole enterprise risk management framework is kept alive. And I hope that, sort of through my examples, I have also demonstrated that this is not a static activity and that companies are required and need to be alive to this on an everyday basis to stay ahead of the competition. So in practice, there is no best way to manage risk. It evolves. I've done this in different geographies. I've done this in different industries. I've done this with different types of companies, either promoter-driven, professionally managed, not yet with government-owned, but each one has a very different perspective to how they deploy their enterprise-wide risk management strategies. And therefore, there is no right answer. There is no one size that fits all. The COSO model and the commentary that goes along with that, which is a couple of 100 pages, provides enough flexibility on how you can actually deploy that. And at the end of the day, this is something that you only come to know much later in terms of whether this was successful or not. Boards of directors and audit committees are focusing on this aspect increasingly over the past 3 or 4 years. I myself attend a few of these audit committees for the clients that I work with, and we end up spending at least half a day at times just discussing this one important aspect. This is on everybody's agenda. Every audit committee meeting that happens every quarter, enterprise-wide risk management is something that's always on their agenda, and they essentially want to ensure that the management is alive to this aspect and that they continuously are making sure that they are reacting and putting in place strategies to effectively mitigate that. And lastly, I think the winners today are using this tool to their advantage. If you are thoughtful in how you approach it, if you're proactive, but more importantly, if you're realistic in how you approach enterprise risk management, those are the companies that are coming out winners in the final analysis. That's all that I had to say on this topic. Thank you.